If you want to become a college professor, you need to listen to this podcast.
I am a first-gen college student. My parents did not go to college. And so when I started in grad school, I didn't even know what a postdoc was.
I had a professor my freshman year of college, and he told me he thought I had qualities that would make me a good faculty member.
If this is my competition, I'm never going to get a job. So I applied to 70 places.
The teaching-focused element it's not a cheat code because you have to really love teaching, but I do feel like it's kind of this sub-pathway that nobody really talks about.
Keeping your eye on what's keeping you in it. It's not going to be the money, right?
I'd had conversations with my PI, my mentor, and she was like, I'm not really interested in that part. So if you want to take it as a project to work on in your next job, go for it.
I know what I'm in it for. I'm in it because this is a career where I can think, and I feel like I am largely paid to think, and I'm paid to be creative, and I am paid to share knowledge and to bring students in and mentor and show them how they can start to independently think and ask questions and become scientists.
If this kind of conversation about academic careers is helpful to you, hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel and it lets me know to keep making more episodes just like this. First up is Dr. Stacy Malaker, who's an assistant professor of chemistry at Yale University. Who or what sparked your interest in academia? Was there a moment where you were like, this is the thing that I for sure want to do?
Yes, but it's kind of a long story. So I am a first-gen college student. My parents did not go to college, and when I started grad school, I went to grad school basically to kind of punt off getting a real job because I'm from Detroit, and in 2009 there were no jobs, right? Height of the recession, and so when I started in grad school, I didn't even know what a postdoc was. Like I was blind to the career path that was academia. And it wasn't until my third year or into my fourth year of grad school when I'd been trying to get an experiment to work for a year. I had like a solid year of not having a single experiment work, and it was like banging my head against the wall. And then finally it worked. And that moment, where I just like walked into my boss's office and was like, I did it, was like, you know what? I think I get this research thing now, and so that kind of stimulated me on the path to, pursuing a postdoc and so on. But I've always kept options open along the way. I've never really been one of those people that's like, the only thing I will do is be a professor.
That's really fascinating. So I know that you did your undergraduate degree at University of Michigan. So that entire time that you were there, even though it's, a place that constantly breeds future academics, even at that time, you had no real like genuine passion or drive towards that end goal.
Yeah. So first of all, go blue. You can see the Michigan Stadium in the background. But secondly, yeah. So in undergrad, I worked two jobs. One was at a grocery store and the other was in a core facility. And so I was gaining lab experience without really recognizing that I was gaining lab experience. So I did peptide synthesis, and then we used mass spec for quality control. So it was like, I didn't really recognize, what was going on around me. I was just making peptides for these people that were doing research.
Interesting. You finished up at Michigan, and as you mentioned, it's the height of the Great Recession, and jobs are scarce, and you went to graduate school. And I hear this often from some of my colleagues that even they also similarly went into graduate school simply to put off a decision for the future, which is interesting because I encounter, and maybe it's because of the type of institution that I'm at, a lot of overachievers who know basically from the day they were born that this is the thing they want to do. I think back about this often. I had a friend in graduate school whose father was the head of the Whitehead Institute at MIT, and he was an MD from Harvard, and his wife was a doctor from Harvard, and his sister was a doctor from Harvard, and she was an undergrad at MIT who later went and got her MD at Harvard.
This is
And
the
it's like,
antithesis of my family.
yeah, so it's fascinating. You mentioned that you're a you were a first gen college student, and now you're a professor at Yale University, an Ivy League, one of the greatest institutions in our country. And I'm fascinated. Did you feel at any of those moments almost like you didn't belong?
Oh, absolutely. I think at UVA which UVA is a top 50 chemistry program, right? But it's not top 10. And I felt like at UVA, I kind of fit in with my colleagues, my surroundings. It was really when I got to Carolyn's lab for my postdoc at Stanford where I was like, I am surrounded by the smartest people I have ever met. And the imposter syndrome kicked in for real at that time. And I think pushed me to really prove my worth, and work that much harder, which I guess is probably not a bad thing. But
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I often get asked this question from students, and I'm curious to hear you speak at it because you went from Michigan to UVA, which you mentioned is a top 50 school, to Stanford, which is definitely a top institution in this country. I get questions from Georgia Tech students. Is there a difference between Georgia Tech and MIT? And I think for the most part, what I try to tell them is that the level of intellect amongst the highest achievers is pretty comparable, but the difference that I see is the level of passion or perseverance. And I don't know how to phrase this without sounding, like pro work culture, but at Georgia Tech, many of the grad students will work a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. But at MIT, everyone was everyone was working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. or later, 6 or 7 days a week. There were people there on Christmas and Thanksgiving. They didn't take breaks. They didn't take and even though I felt like their intellect was on par, it was almost like they had this innate drive that was superior. And that's what made them so successful. And I'm curious, what was your experience at those different institutions?
almost exactly the same. Yeah. So at UVA, I worked pretty normal hours. Yeah, I was there on some weekends and late sometimes, but that was more the exception to the rule versus in Carolyn's lab, man, you could go in at 2 in the morning. There was bound to be somebody there. Weekends, always people there, nights, people are there. And yeah, there just seemed to be like a little bit more fire. And I don't know if that's just because of the culture or because of the people, but it definitely, there was a pretty dramatic difference.
Do you think that it's a necessary requisite to becoming a future faculty member?
Ooh, good question. I don't know the answer to that, truthfully. Um, I'm sure there are people, especially parents, that are out there that are very, very good at managing their time because they have to. And I think those people typically can then go on to a faculty position with the 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, more rigid hours, because they're forced to.
So let me ask you this. So it sounds to me like that experience during your postdoctoral studies at Stanford was really formative in helping you achieve the ultimate goal of becoming a faculty member. Do you think what was it about that experience, besides being surrounded by the best of the best and realizing, hey, I fit in here and I'm pretty good at this thing. What was it about that experience that you think helped springboard you into future success in your academic search?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'd give a ton of credit to my colleagues in Carolyn's lab, and that was just a fantastic environment to be in. But I think the other thing that was really helpful was, well, Carolyn as well, but also I got there, it was really great timing because she had just moved from Berkeley to Stanford, had a sizable startup, and wanted to invest in mass spec. And so she basically handed me $1 million and was like, set up this instrument and get it running. And so that's exactly what I did. And so I was like a mini PI in the lab, kind of operating the instrument, managing it, maintaining it, troubleshooting for everybody in the lab. So if you had a mass spec project, you were probably going through me. And so that gave me kind of almost a pseudo experience of what it's like to be a PI in terms of managing a whole bunch of different projects, upkeeping, this instrument and kind of juggling a lot at once. And just even the installation process and getting all of it off the ground was also helped prepare me for doing it again in my own lab.
Sure, and this brings up something else. So I have one of my favorite students I've ever had just started graduate school, and they ended up joining the lab of a brand new faculty member. And they came to me beforehand and they asked, I'm considering two labs. One is brand new, just literally building their lab up from scratch. The other one is in their 50s, 60s and well established, has a named reaction named after them, the
Right.
whole deal. Um, what do you see as the pros and cons? And I think one of the things that I told them was like, what is your future career aspirations? Is it to, start your own lab one day? Because this is going to give you that experience. Yes, it's going to come with some of the drawbacks, the name recognition alone, which, does matter, is going to be very different for an untenured faculty member versus someone whose, H index is over 120 or whatever. And and ultimately they ended up choosing the brand new lab, and they seem to be having a really great time. So it sounds to me like in your postdoc experience, you got the lay of the land as to what it might be like to be a brand new faculty member.
Yeah, I basically got the best of both worlds, right? Because I got the new lab, setting up experience, but also got the Nobel laureate name associated with it, right?
Right. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
And it's funny because I just had this conversation with my first undergrad, who's my second employee, and she's now at Penn doing her MD PhD, and she was torn between name recognition and brand new person, and but she had the experience in my lab of knowing what it was like to be the second employee of a brand new faculty member, right? And
Sure.
she lauded just how excited I was about everything and like how hands-on I was and how much FaceTime she got with me. And so, there are absolutely benefits, but for a hiring perspective, I think there's definitely something to be said about the name brand that big PIs come with. So I think as long as you have a name brand on your CV, that's probably important. But then like is getting the experience from a new PI, whether it be at the undergrad, PhD, or postdoc level, I think is valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I often try to convey this to students. Many of them think that every step of the journey has to be at the best of the best. And I think that, you mentioned, and now you're at, one of the premier institutions in our country. There was this paper that came out. I remember reading it in graduate school or something, but there was a paper that came out that said that if you want to be a faculty member, you need at a R1 institution, you need to have touched at some point in time Harvard, MIT, or Stanford as one of the
Oh,
three
I know
places.
exactly what you're
And
talking about.
and
Yes.
and it was this weave where it was like basically they just go off, and as long as you've touched one of those points, you're likely to end up in a faculty role. So I tell them that, I'm not. It doesn't. There's for sure exceptions, right? There are many faculty member at many of the top institutions that went to schools outside of even the top 50 on U.S. News for chemistry. I think your brilliance can shine through in many ways, and not necessarily requires you to follow a very specific pathway. And that's what I'm hoping to showcase in this episode. Um, so so you ultimately obtained, a position that you seem to be very content at and happy and satisfied with, but it's in a very different part of the country from where you grew up. So can you explain to some people what it was like applying to schools? Because I remember talking to my mom when I first got my first faculty position, and she was like, "Why do you want to live out in the middle of nowhere, someplace you've never been before?" And I'm like, "Mom, I don't just get to pick and say, this city is where I want to live. So hey, big institution up the road, can you please hire me?"
Yeah. So, I mean, when I went on the job market, I was not, a lot of people have two body problems and are limited geographically by, or, they want to be close to family. And so they're only going to apply within a certain range. But I didn't limit myself in that way, partially because I was going on the market at the same time as two or actually three other members of my same lab,
Wow.
one of whom ended up at Harvard and the other one ended up at Stanford. And I was like, if this is my competition, I'm never going to get a job. So I applied to 70 places. And so I cast
70.
70. I
Wow.
cast as wide of a net as I possibly could. Um, and yeah, I went on 15 interviews. So happy to talk about
That's
that
15
experience.
in-person interviews.
In-person interviews.
Okay, can you tell me what time period this was?
This was the 19 into 20 cycle.
Okay, so maybe right before people were like, "Hey, don't come visit anymore
So
because of COVID?"
I finished my last interview on March 15th of 2020.
Wow. Okay,
Yes.
congratulations. It couldn't come any sooner. So you applied to 70 schools. I'm assuming that some number less than 70 you did phone or Zoom type interviews.
Yeah, and I don't have a number for that, but
Yeah,
I
that's
did a
fine.
handful, yeah.
And then 15 in-person interviews, and then um I don't know if you want to share how many offers you fielded that you allowed you to make your final decision.
Yeah, so I had 8 offers. There were a number of schools that had not made a decision by the time I had to make a decision. Because what happened was shut down, obviously, the day after I got back from my last interview. Um, 2 weeks later, Carolyn called me and was like, "Hey, hiring freezes are going into effect. What's your top choice? Where do you have a written offer?" And like negotiate what you can and sign. And
Sure.
so Yale was my best offer, and it was already my top choice anyway. I wanted to go somewhere with a med school. They really understood what I was doing, the value of what I was doing, and so yeah, I signed on March 25th of 2020, and the hiring freeze at Yale went into effect on April 7th.
That's
So
amazing.
just slid
Congratulations.
right in there. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And for people who don't know, this is for sure a thing that was going on in the background because obviously, we're 5 years past that time, almost 6 years past that time now. So it's easy to look back in hindsight to figure out what happened financially to these institutions. But it was a very tenuous time. Nobody knew what was going to happen, right?
No.
We didn't
Yeah.
know if the world was going to end.
It was, yeah, crazy, crazy
Yeah.
times.
So what do you think so to anyone listening or watching this, that is incredibly uncommon. This story is showcasing the remarkable success you had in your job search. Even for someone who's worked for a Nobel laureate at some point in time, to get 15 on campus interviews, 8 offers, etc. This is incredibly uncommon. And so what do you think made you so successful? What are the aspects of your journey that you think ultimately allowed you to be so successful in your pursuit of this position?
So I I like to think of it as I took one of the top mass spec people in the world and one of the, if not the most successful glyco people in the world. And I smashed them together and I created my own little niche. And so now I'm one of the best glycoproteomic people in the world. And so positioning myself in that niche where I recognized there weren't a lot of people in the space, I recognized that I could kind of, be that person that people think of or go to for that. And so oftentimes when people are considering postdocs, I tell them to try to position themselves in a way where they can bring something new to a lab, gain something from that lab, and then merge their PhD and postdoc into a space that creates something that's unique to them.
I think that's really great advice. I try to give the same where it's a lot of the students that I see that are undergraduates currently doing research, they want to go to a graduate lab that does very similar research. I'm like, you already know this thing. If you've been in that lab for the last 3 years, you know this enough. Go and learn something else because eventually you're going to have to come up with something brand new, of
Right.
which neither of them are the exact same. So go broaden your horizons, if you will. That's a fantastic wisdom that you're sharing with us. I really appreciate that. So let me ask you one last question. I'd like to think that the people that are really interested in this might one day want to pursue their own faculty positions at some point in time. What one piece of advice, one nugget could you provide to someone whose career aspirations are to ultimately become a faculty member at an institution of higher education?
I thought about this when I read your list of questions, and I mean, there's so many pieces of advice that I wish I had when I was starting out,
If
but I
feel free
think
to drop as much knowledge as you want.
well, one of the things that I didn't really realize or think about because when I was Don, was 70 years old when I started in his lab, right? I mean, the man was already very well established and well known and so we didn't really go to conferences that much. We went to ASMS every year and that was kind of like the conference. And I really kind of had the notion that the science would just speak for itself and that,
Mm.
networking, I didn't even know the term networking, right? And then I got to Carolyn's lab, and in particular, I have a colleague, Nick Riley, who's now a faculty member at UW, and he is just like the most extroverted person, and I'm actually quite introverted. I can socialize fine, but I like my alone time.
Sure.
And I had a very hard time just sticking myself in front of famous names in the field. And Nick, he'll just go up to anybody and just be like, "Hey." And so everybody knew who he was when I went to conferences with him. And I was like, how do I become this? So I basically just latched on to Nick and like, followed him around a few conferences and then started building my own network and recognized how important that is for just the name recognition itself. And like, what and what you're doing in science is almost, if not, as important as uh who because if somebody's on a search committee and they recognize your name out of the 350 applicants, it's more likely they're going to pull your name than if they have no idea who you are. And that's not to say the science is very, very important, but the name definitely helps.
You don't want to miss this next conversation because it brings the unique perspective from Dr. Michelle Moyer, who's an ornithologist at a public liberal arts college. Dr. Moyer, what made you decide to become a professor of ornithology?
It's a great question. I mean, I always joke that I'm a recovering horse girl. I think I've always been really into animals my whole life. And I knew that I knew that I wanted to do something with that interest. I've always been really excited about studying different questions and answering exciting animal related questions. But when I was in high school, I volunteered at a wildlife rehab center.
Oh,
And
wow.
they had a pelican as one of the patients. And that was like the biggest animal I'd ever been that close to in my life. And that was pretty much it. I was hooked from there, and I took an ornithology class in undergrad. And I've been obsessed with birds ever since. That was pretty
Wow,
much the
that's
downfall.
yeah, no, that sounds really cool. It sounds like a really transformative experience.
It was.
So even back then, even though this happened in high school, did you think, I fell in love with animals and particularly birds, I should pursue a career in higher education? Or was it just anything with birds, so you started undergrad with that pursuit in mind?
Yeah, I think I definitely started out very research focused. We had some activities in high school where we had to volunteer in labs or do job shadows and things like that. And so I had shadowed scientists doing different kinds of research. And so I had this vision in my head that I was just going to be doing really intense research. That was what I wanted to do. I didn't know what field I was going to do it in. But I was definitely very research oriented. And I didn't really think about that as necessarily being a professor. I just thought that could look at it, I could be in a nonprofit, or I could be working for the government, or I could be in any number of capacities. And I didn't actually think about being a professor at all. And then weirdly, I always I think about this all the time. I had a professor my freshman year of college, maybe only a few months in, and we had to have one-on-one meetings with the professor as part of this seminar that we were taking. Seminar was about infectious disease, I think. And he told me he thought I had qualities that would make me a good faculty member, which
Oh,
looking back
wow.
blows my mind because I don't know what impression he would have gotten from 17-year-old me. And I basically just was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do now. I will believe you and follow that path. Um,
It's amazing how just, someone believing in you can have such an impact in that way.
Well, and the way he described it, I think he was the first person to explain what that meant, what being a faculty member meant, that you got to teach and do research and work with students your whole life and kind of be immersed in that kind of learning environment for your career. And it didn't just have to be only research. There could be other ways to spend your time. That really appealed to me. And so that was I think that was the jumping off point that made me want to look into that career choice further.
And I think that that's so important because, like, for me, for example, I was no one in my family is in higher education. No one in my family is a scientist. So I had no idea that this is even a job you could have, right? Was
Yeah.
it similar for you?
It was, yeah. I have family members I have a family member who's a vet and things like that. So I've had some family members pursue higher degrees, but nobody had ever done the PhD thing. No one had ever gone to grad school. And I think a professor to me just was college teacher. I didn't necessarily think about it as beyond. I didn't separate the research and the teaching, and I didn't think about them as a valid career path or as an option necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. So I, depending on what institution you're at, I know that many faculty have been through very prestigious undergraduate education and then graduate work and then potentially even a postdoctoral study afterwards. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey and where you started at undergrad?
Yep. So I grew up in Colorado and I went to Colorado State University, which is a really large school. And I loved that about it. I loved that there were lots of students there. But now I'm at Georgia College now, which is a very small school. And I almost wish that I had been in more of a small student focused environment like that. I think I would have thrived in that kind of one-on-one attention with the faculty. But it was a really good experience undergraduate wise. I majored in zoology. And I really thought I was going to be doing laboratory based research. So I volunteered in a lot of different labs. And then I took a couple years off after undergrad. I taught English in Hungary for a while
Oh, wow.
as part of a volunteer program, which I really, really tell my students I think everybody should take at least 1 year off between undergrad and graduate school. And I don't know if this is your sense, but I feel like that advice is becoming less popular. I feel like they're pushing people to go straight from undergrad to graduate school now, which I think is a shame. I think those experiences were so transformative for me and also helped solidify that I wanted to come back because I feel like if you don't, I hear a lot of students say, if I don't go to grad school now, I'll never go. And to me, that's a blessing. You shouldn't go back. If it's
Right.
just the momentum from undergrad that's getting you there, you're not gonna thrive in that environment. I think you have to really want to be there. So
Absolutely.
I had 2 years off. I'm not. Did you have time off between?
I actually took 6 years off between high school and
Even better.
college. So that
Oh
was
wow.
yeah, so to stay on the subject, it's interesting that you bring it up because I think I actually experienced the opposite, where it's mostly students that are like, I got to get this done as quickly as
Mm,
possible, or else I'm going to be too old to do it.
yeah.
And then I tell them the story of how I didn't get my bachelor's degree until I was 28, and then I
Yeah.
started graduate school at 28, and they're like, oh, that's ancient, and I'm like, no, it's fine. You're one day we're all going to be 40. Do you want to be 40
Yeah.
doing the thing that you enjoy doing or not?
Yeah.
You know.
The years will pass, the time will pass anyway, so it's just a matter of how you're spending that time. I
Right.
felt that pressure for sure. I had some insight that I wanted to have my PhD before I was a certain age or things like that. I had that pressure in my head. And I had also been told that the pathway to getting a professor position is you do a PhD, which is 5 to 7 years, maybe a master's beforehand. And then you also do at least two postdocs, which could be 2 to 3 years each. So it's like an 11-year process to maybe your first position. And so I had this 11-year experience looming over me when I was finishing undergrad, and I just didn't want that sounded terrible. I wasn't looking forward to spending 11 years in this system to maybe get a job at the end of it. And I've gotten, I think, lucky, and I also chose a different path that my path to my first position didn't take 11 years. But I think
Yeah,
that's the
so
traditional story.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and you're absolutely spot on because I think probably when people think about college professor, they probably think large R1 type of institution that
Yep.
is PhD granting, 30 to 40,000 students, very much research heavy focus, where even the faculty are more interested perhaps in their research than they are in teaching. And
Yep.
now, can you talk to me a little bit about the type of institution that you're at Georgia College and State University, and how that might differ from that traditional understanding of what college is like?
Yeah. So Georgia College is the public liberal arts college of Georgia, of the University of Georgia system. And so we're about 5,000 undergrad compared to 32,000 where I went at Colorado State. And the student faculty ratio is something like 14 to 1. So most of our classes are, 15 to 50 students. The largest class I teach is 45, something like that.
Wow.
When I was a freshman, I had lectures of 250 or 300 students where the faculty did not know any of our names. Um, the trade-off of that, I mean, I have a much higher teaching load than some of my colleagues who are at an R1 institution. So the amount of time I get to spend on my research is a little bit different. And I'm primarily evaluated on my teaching. That's a lot of what my job is based on. But that's what I wanted. I chose that intentionally. And I think I also get to do research with undergraduates, and I'm in Puerto Rico right now doing field work. And I think a lot of people at R1 institutions end up somewhat separated from the hands-on research element of things if they're mostly directing graduate or undergraduates and they don't necessarily get to do the fun part as much. It
Sure.
depends on the school, I'm sure. But I feel really lucky that I still get to be very much I feel like I'm just driving my research with my students by my side and in a very intentional way. Um, the trade-off, like I said, is I have way less time for it than given my high teaching load, but that's luckily I really like to teach. So
Yeah, I'm the same way where my very first job out of graduate school was a place where I was expected to do a whole lot of research and get external funding. And now I'm in a mostly teaching focused environment where I can do research, but it's not a requirement. So it's
yeah.
almost like only if I want to. And I
Yep.
do very often want to, but I really love teaching and thinking about pedagogy and how to effectively
Hmm.
communicate scientific ideas. Like, when people think about, I think when people think about what a college professor does, those parts of my job I actually really love the most. So that
Yeah.
teaching and the talking to students part and having office hours and doing all those things, interacting with students, those are the parts that I love much more so than the administrative stuff that has to be done on the side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
So
feel like that's a different way of thinking about it than I was shown at a big R1 institution. A lot of the professors complained about having to teach, or they only taught one class a year, and it was a class that they taught 30 times, and so it felt a little bit repetitive for them. And so it's really refreshing to be in an environment where people are constantly trying to create new teaching ideas or figure out different ways to teach the same material to a different group of students. It's really fun.
that's really cool. I'm glad that you were able to find that. So,
Yeah.
traditionally, when we think about being a professor at, let's just pick a random school that's pretty good. Let's just say you were a professor at UC Berkeley. I think
Mhm.
that the traditional pathway is go to undergrad, PhD, at least one postdoc. You mentioned this 11-year cycle that it could be. Was your route to getting a position at the type of institution that you're at similar, or was there things that were more truncated as a result?
Yeah, I feel like the teaching focused element is it's not a cheat code because you have to really love teaching, but I do feel like it's kind of this sub pathway that nobody really talks about. And I because I think not everyone focuses so hard on the teaching side of things. And in fact, there was a period of time when I was getting close to defending my PhD that I had was just planning to only teach. I wasn't planning to apply for any research positions. And I maybe lecturer only or kind of a position where research is an option but not required. And so I wasn't looking into any postdocs at all. I looked into lecture positions and then I applied to a lot of visiting assistant professor positions or visiting teaching positions. I think one of the things that helped me the most as I was finishing up my PhD was I actually taught as instructor of record as a graduate student.
Oh,
I
nice.
taught two different summer classes, or the same class twice rather, as instructor of record, which really for me was such useful experience of how to teach a college class. And it also really solidified that that's what I love. That's what really fulfills me. Because I had a mentor once, one of my teaching mentors in graduate school said, if you absolutely had to pick, you can't do both. You have to pick research or teaching. Which would you do? And it's for me, it's an easy answer, and that's teaching. And so that helped me figure out that that's what my priority needs to be moving forward. And so rather than doing a postdoc, I took a visiting, I think my official title was visiting assistant teaching professor at the College of William and Mary.
Oh, nice.
And so I was teaching a number of different classes there. And as soon as I arrived, I started to miss research with students. And luckily they were really supportive of me taking some students on. And so I did a number of research projects while I was there. But I feel like I got to be essentially a faculty member with training wheels. I got to learn the ins and outs of the university system and different discussions and decisions that have to be made as instructor of record that were kind of, I was a little protected from as a graduate student. And I also got to try out having a small research lab. And so that is what led me to my first faculty position at Georgia College. I didn't do any postdoc. I was a visiting professor for 1 year, and then I landed my current position, which is a lot faster, I think, than having to do 2 or 3 postdocs. And I think it was my teaching experience is what got me the position. I really believe that. I have a number of publications, but none of them are in huge, high ranking journals. And I don't think it was my research experience that is what got me the position. I think it's my dedication to teaching and my teaching experience, and also how many students I've mentored. That was another big piece of it.
And
But yeah,
I bet that your students are really beneficiaries of your passion for teaching and your previous
I hope
experience.
so. I hope
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
No, it definitely comes across as though you really care about, being in the classroom. So that's awesome that you were able to achieve that. So, just to really condense that into almost something that someone could take away from this is that if you're interested, so when speaking to people whose main focus is research, you oftentimes hear that their postdoctoral experience was able to allow them to be more independent and
Hmm.
up with their own ideas, which is kind of like training wheels for what they would have to do as a PI
Yeah.
and or principal investigator. And for you, it sounds to me like uh, your experience doing the teaching as instructor of record as a graduate student, which by the way, for anyone listening, that's incredibly rare to be offered that opportunity. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's usually the opposite where they would discourage you from doing any teaching. Instead, hey, get
Well,
back in
I
the
should
lab and
say they didn't necessarily I fought for that. My advisor and I fought for that opportunity. I think that's a good
wow,
piece of advice is it wasn't designed that way. I most of my my graduate period, my time in graduate school, I was a TA for all of my semesters except for one, which I know is pretty unusual.
sure.
At least for the ecology evolution students in my department, that was pretty common. We weren't necessarily funded by large external grants, so most of our funding came from being a teaching assistant. But my advisor and I really fought for that summer teaching opportunity. And the department ended up being very supportive of it and excited that I wanted to do that, but it was not an
Sure.
opportunity that existed on its own. So I would say even if someone's department doesn't offer you that chance, ask for it because they might be really excited to let you do that.
That's really great advice. So, to hearing your journey, it sounds like you started in Colorado and
Hmm.
then you did your graduate work at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Is
Yes,
that right?
UMBC,
And
University of Maryland,
then,
Baltimore County.
yeah. And then you went to the College of William and Mary, and now
Yes,
you're in Milledgeville, Georgia. So kind
yes,
of ping ponging all over the
all
place.
over. Yep.
And I think that's something that people really don't understand is that when you go to apply for positions, you kind of don't have really too much of a say because you're just like shotgunning applications across the country and hoping for the best. Can you talk to me about your experience and how you
Yeah.
feel about ending up where in, Milledgeville, Georgia?
Yeah. No, it's definitely it was a really interesting experience. I think especially for graduate school, I was always kind of told that the location doesn't matter. It's the advisor who matters more. I had never been to Maryland other than maybe slightly north of DC. So I had no idea what I was going into when I moved to the East Coast. And then I had some intention of staying locally, that staying near to family and things or to friends on the East Coast. But yeah, it really comes down to what is the best fit position wise. You don't necessarily have as much flexibility. And at the time when I was applying for faculty positions, it was during some of the uncertainty with funding where a lot of institutions were freezing funding. And so a lot of positions weren't available. So
Right.
I feel especially lucky that my timing worked out the way it did. I had a couple of different offers at the time, and I did make the decision on a number of different factors, one of them being location. Um, I've also never lived in the South before. It's been a different experience. It's a culture shock in many ways. The
Sure.
South is a different place, but I'm really enjoying it, honestly. I think it's been really good for me to get out of my comfort zone in different ways. And a lot of people ask, why would you move to Central Georgia if you don't know anybody there, don't have any family in the region? But it's a good job and it's a good school, and I think that's one of the unique things of academia is you get to end up in a place you didn't necessarily expect to. Um, I have friends who are limited geographically and their job search is far more difficult. I was lucky that I had the flexibility to just go wherever the job was the best fit.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's working out for you in that way and that you're
Yeah.
really enjoying the experience. To kind of bring this all together, it sounds to me like you fell in love with animals, fell in love with birds, went to undergrad with the interest of pursuing that passion and that interest. And along the way, a mentor came along and suggested this career path for you before that you hadn't really considered previously. You pursued graduate work towards that end. Um, and it seems to have worked out for you. And I think that to hear it put so succinctly makes it seem incredibly straightforward and easy. Like you put your mind to it and you can achieve anything you want. But I'm sure along
Yeah.
the way there were challenges. Can you talk about any sort of challenges that you faced along this journey and maybe any doubts that crept up along the way?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think one of the hardest decisions was deciding if I wanted to stay in academia at all, if I wanted to just teach, like I said, or include research. I think the academic system is so bizarre, and there's so many unspoken rules about how to apply and who to talk to and what you're supposed to put on applications and what you're not supposed to do. And there's just so many pieces of the job market or types of jobs that no one really talks about. And so I found that especially incredibly daunting of trying to figure out what can I do with this degree. I think there's a lot of jobs that I could have been really content doing that didn't require a PhD at all. And I think some of the prestige of graduate school was kind of masked some of that for me. Of there were positions that I could have been maybe more successful in or gotten a job more quickly had I not gone to graduate school or had I just gotten a master's and or not just a master's, but had I stopped after the master's.
Sure.
Um, so I think persevering through some of that doubt and some of that confusion, I've been really lucky to have a number of very gifted mentors, very devoted mentors who listened to my anxieties and reviewed all of my application materials all the time and wrote me countless letters of rec. I think that was the biggest source of support for me it was my mentors and my family who were very supportive of just the chaos. My parents still would always just say, "Well, but where are you going? You're moving where?" And what you would just I just thought you applied to that school and now you're applying to this school. And I think that academia is such a black box for so many people. But I also think at the end of the day, it is just a job. There's so many different systems and people, are you going to get tenure? Are you going to have job security? There are no other job in the world has this tenure system. And I
Sure.
think we put so much pressure on certain statuses of the university or of the location. And it's a job. It should not be the only thing that you're doing in your life. It shouldn't be the only thing that you get fulfillment from. So I think all those things I'm still learning and still working through. It's my first semester. So I'm saying a lot of things about
Right.
the position having really not done it for very long. And it's been a really challenging semester. There's a lot of growing and learning that has to happen right away. But it has definitely been a circuitous path. I think one of the things I think about all the time and I tell my students often is I have never met anybody who has the same path as somebody else. And yet they have still gotten there somehow to wherever they needed to be or wanted to be. So I think and I'm sure you're encountering that with the people that you're talking to. Everybody has some very circuitous path to where they end up.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's definitely good to keep that perspective. And ultimately, that's what I'm trying to convey here in the amalgamation of all these different interviews is that there's not a single pathway, that everyone's
No,
path looks a little bit different. And, you know, I wish that I could give you a list, steps 1 through 7, on how to
I
become
know.
professor at Harvard, but unfortunately, that list doesn't exist.
And I thought I was following that list, and I didn't like where I was going with when I was following. I didn't want to be at an R1 research focused, and I started to go really hard the other direction and got pulled kind of back to what I feel is a really happy medium. So I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of options out there that aren't necessarily talked about with the same reverence. I feel like teaching focused positions don't get the same amount of reverence or respect, and I feel like they really should. We're the ones, we do a lot of important work for students and keep universities running. So you
I
need
couldn't
people who
agree
want to
more.
teach.
I couldn't agree more. So to wrap everything up and kind of bring things together, Dr. Moyer, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who is maybe starting out this journey, who's interested in pursuing a career in academia, what would you say to them?
Oh, I've been thinking about that. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard for many years is that it's a marathon and not a sprint. It's what people talk about during graduate school, but you just can't race like your way through these steps, and you can't force things to happen before they're going to. And also you will burn yourself out so fast if you push too hard. I know people who have pushed to get some really prestigious postdoc and they're so exhausted that they can't do well in that position. So if you are burning yourself out through undergrad already, it's going to be really hard to even get to graduate school, let alone survive it, let alone get to the faculty job market. So I think maintaining some sort of self-care and life balance that protects your own sanity throughout the process is the only way to make sure that it is a sustainable process for you.
Next up is ecologist Dr. Alice Besterman, who's an assistant professor at Towson University. Dr. Besterman, why did you decide to become a professor?
So I had a very transformative experience as an undergraduate, actually. I had started for 2 years. I was a humanities major, and then that just really was not a good fit. And
Oh,
then
wow.
I was trying to get my footing in environmental science, and I took this trip to Panama, which was a really amazing experience. And it was in avian ecology, and it was just absolutely life altering. I'd never thought about any of those questions. I'd never done ecological research. I'd never done field work. I had never thought about science in that way. And by the end of the trip, I asked my instructor for that study abroad, how do I do this for a living? And
Wow.
basically from there, it's history, as they say. So that was pretty much, that was that.
That's really cool. I very rarely hear stories of people transitioning from the humanities into the sciences. In most cases, it's the opposite direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
That,
Yeah. I was religious studies and anthropology. And I feel like that I don't know, that was maybe more of like an identity thing that I was going in
sure.
that direction, and I didn't identify as someone who's good at science, but I was always good at science. But I found college level humanities. I was really struggling with the not right. We struggle with objectivity in science too, right? There isn't perfect knowledge, but I really struggled with the subjectivity and lack of objectivity within the humanities. And I was like, I need something with a little bit more data behind it. And yeah, really just got into biology and went from there.
That's a really cool story. So you mentioned that this happened when you were an undergrad, and this was at Virginia Commonwealth University. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. So then, are you from Virginia originally?
Yeah, yes, I am from Northern Virginia.
Oh,
And
nice.
then, yeah, did undergrad at VCU in Richmond, Virginia, and then did grad school in Virginia as well.
Yeah, so saw that you did your PhD at the University of Virginia. What made you decide? So obviously, you had talked to this instructor who had kind of given you some of the lay of the land as it relates to how to become a faculty member and do this for a living. But what was that process like of transitioning from undergrad to graduate school?
Um, it was fairly easy for me. I took a year off while I applied to graduate school. So I applied
What'd you
for MS.
do? What'd you do
I
during that time?
I went all my friends are, into music and artsy stuff, and they all went to LA. That's what everyone did, and so I went to LA too, and I worked in a restaurant. And in that time, I applied for the NSF-GRFP, and I actually volunteered in a lab with someone at UCLA just because I wanted to keep getting some experience, and so I
Nice.
got to do count some barnacles in Santa Barbara, so that was pretty fun. Um and then I really just looked around for labs that did food web stuff is what I was getting really interested in at that point. And so I
Mm.
found a lab in Charlottesville and or at EVA, and then yeah, applied there. I think that transition was pretty easy for me. I think um, uh, some of the things that make something that can make you a successful graduate student, I think, is the ability to really lock in, as my Gen Z students say, and hone in on something and really hyper focus on it.
Sure.
And I can be really good at that. And so I think grad school was a pretty easy transition because you have to just blinders on for something for a while.
So I know that for sure most of my peers, when we started graduate school, if I had polled all of my entering class, and I was a chemistry graduate student, I think about 90% of them would have said, I aspire to become a faculty member and a professor in higher education. And then by the time those of us who finished our PhD, I would argue that that number had dwindled over 50%. So let's say that 35% now want to continue this path towards a career in higher education. And then many go into a postdoc, and then that number dwindles considerably more to where, let's say 5% end up continuing to pursue that path. And then fewer are able to achieve that ultimate goal. So during your time at UVA, was your passion towards higher education and becoming a faculty member reinforced? Did you face challenges and did you ever doubt that this career path was truly for you?
I didn't. I think I had a lab that we were all very supportive, and we all, I think, were very fortunate in that we were pretty successful with what we were trying to do. And so I
Sure.
think there was a lot of positive reinforcement within our group. Within the larger grad student body, I think some students had more difficulty, and definitely some of that um I need to get out of this, and I don't want to be in academia was there. But within my lab group, we had a really incredible mentor was a part of it. He was wonderful and super supportive, still is. He's still a great friend and mentor to all of us. And I think that positive energy and just everyone sort of like was doing well. I think we all came out of it and went for faculty jobs. So,
Oh wow. That's pretty spectacular and pretty rare, I would argue. I think
yeah.
many people are dissuaded by their experience with their faculty principal investigator in graduate school. So talk to me a little bit about that, and maybe what are some tips that you would give to maybe first year grad students who are thinking about which PI to pick as their PhD advisor.
Probably the happiness of the graduate students is one of the main things. I mean, you also that can also be really challenging, right? Because different advisors work for different students. So you don't want to allow someone's bad experience to completely turn you away. But when I had four people in the lab all saying you can't get a better advisor than our advisor. Like if you get this position, you should come. Like there's no better. He is so helpful and supportive and he cares. Um and I in other places I was interviewing was not hearing that
Mm.
from the graduate students. So that was very influential. And I think it's probably one of the strongest indicators of are the students happy? Are they successful? Or are they burned out and wanting to quit? And get out.
Who was your advisor? I just want to make sure that we give them their flowers.
His name's Michael Pace. He just
Okay.
retired from UVA.
Hey, very nice. That's cool. So you had a successful graduate education, and you were able to successfully obtain your PhD from the University of Virginia, and then you went and did a postdoc. And I want you to talk a little bit about this postdoc experience. What made you choose this one in particular? How it went, and kind of describe it in pretty significant detail because I think it's pretty rare. So most people that I've spoken to, particularly for this episode of the podcast, those that did a postdoc, it was they went to a completely different university or maybe the same one, and they just worked for a different principal investigator doing something else, maybe tangentially related, but outside of their original PhD thesis. And in that way, it almost seems like an extension and maybe a more independent version of their graduate studies of just working in the lab for 5 to 7 years and writing up a thesis. And yours is very different because you were a postdoctoral fellow at the Woodwell Climate Research Center and Buzzards Bay Coalition. And this is, I just said the name of it, and that's not Stanford University, Harvard University, whatever. That is a very significant research center. Can you talk to me about that experience?
Yeah. Well, it's one of these asterisks, right? Because I started January 2020, so I had 6 weeks in the position, and two really excellent happy hours with the research associates at Grumpy's, the awesome dive in Falmouth, Massachusetts, before complete shutdown.
Wow.
So I still got a lot out of it, and it still was a great experience. But I was so the position was so really, the reason is because I met Linda Deegan. She's a PI at Woodwell Climate Research Center at a conference. I found her work. I emailed her. I saw she was going to be there, and I went and found her and said, "Hey, can we talk about research or postdoc options?" And she put me on to some potential fellowships and grants, and we started applying for those. She already had a partnership with that nonprofit, Buzzards Bay Coalition, and Rachel Takuba, who works there. Um, and the three of us started working on a couple proposals, and we got funding. And so that really informed it. It was a proposal I mostly wrote, and we got it funded. And so that's where I went. The attraction was definitely I was looking for people doing a certain type of research. Um, I had done my PhD on mudflats, which most people probably are not even familiar with, but they're like the intertidal area between marshes and open water, and there's no vegetation there. And
Hmm.
they're just like moving through this giant chocolate pudding landscape.
I'm
Um,
envisioning lots of worms.
Oh, so many
Am I
worms.
okay?
So
Got
many
it.
worms. Lots and lots of polychaetes. They're really beautiful and amphipods and snails. Yeah, super cool. But very physically difficult environment to work in. I actually got some injuries during grad school that
Oh, wow.
required surgery that I partially blame on working in a mud flat for 5 years. So I was looking for more steady ground to work on. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to move up in elevation into the marsh. And so that was part of the motivation to get into a different system was just the physicality. So we wrote the grant, we got it funded. And I think what ended up being really interesting and unique there is I ended up being primarily actually based at the nonprofit. And so, and that was partly just pandemic stuff and where access was and all of these types of things. So I was kind of equally appointed, but ended up interacting with the nonprofit a little bit more. Um, and that was a really cool experience because putting science in practice and that applied model was really interesting and not something I'd been super exposed to. Thinking about stakeholders and collaborative science and translational science is something that these are all very hot topics, especially in ecology. But I had never really seen it being done. And there I did a lot of it. And those were some of, I think, probably the most useful skills that have translated into the development of my research program here now. That translational aspect and working with practitioners and non-scientists while doing science.
And what made you want to pursue this type of postdoctoral experience as opposed to maybe the more traditional one that takes place at another university?
You know, I it's like how do you say it? It's what I got. So I think I was honestly
That's okay.
looking pretty
It
open. I did have another fellowship that would have been more traditional. It would have been at Florida International. Um, I found out about the other funding first, and so that's, you kind of go where, all right, this is what's come through, and
yeah.
that's where you go.
I think that's I actually really like that story because I think that's the real story in most cases. And it's kind of I think about this a lot when I read papers and it's always written like I had this idea that this brilliant thing would occur and then I tried it and it worked and now I'm brilliant. Let me tell you all about all the ways when the reality is that I tried 50 million things and pursued the thing that hit first. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you sharing that story and keeping it honest with us in that regard. So now you're an assistant professor at Towson University, which for those who don't know is what's designated by the Carnegie Institution as an R3 university. And while Towson states that they're currently trying to pursue becoming an R2 institution, what an R3 institution means is that there's less PhDs that are typically conferred than at an R2 or an R1. Also, the research expenditure is lower than you would expect at an R2 or an R3. And while Towson is making strides towards that, when you applied, they were for sure an R3 institution.
Mm.
And that's different than I think what people think of when they think of, large research focused university. And can you talk to me a little bit about that experience of being at this type of institution, but also maybe more importantly, why that type of university as opposed to a primarily undergraduate institution or an R2 or an R1?
Yep. Well, I'm going to be really honest again. I applied geographically narrow and institutionally broad.
Mm,
um, so I was not applying to many primarily undergrad institutions, and that is because while I do like teaching, I really wanted a major focus on research to be
sure.
still a part of what I was doing. What I also wanted, though, while I'm still applying to R1, I mean, I applied many places as we all do, right? Um, but what I really did want was individual mentorship with undergraduate students. And that's partly because of the experience I had. I had an experience where I can remember not even knowing science was a job that you could do. Like when I heard about scientists, I thought, oh, that's like, I don't know, being a composer in 1800. That's this like old thing. I didn't really understand that people were scientists and that
Sure.
was a career option. And my undergraduate mentor was so influential and important for me, Panama trip and then other undergrad research experiences after that. Um, so I wanted that experience. And here, I mean, where Towson really does, where they don't have many PhD programs at all, and we have some masters, but where that research expenditure goes is for undergraduate research experiences. There's a lot of investment in undergraduate research experiences. It's a really big focus, and it's really a fun, like, how do you say? It fills my cup. It makes me very happy having that experience of working with undergrads in that way. So that is part of what I think in the big scheme of things why I'm like want to be at a university like
That
this.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned at the beginning there that you were geographically restricted as to
Mhm.
where you were applying.
Yeah.
And I think that this is something that a lot of people don't really understand. So when I first started my career, as I mentioned to you via email, I actually started as an assistant professor, which was a tenure track position at a small university called Salisbury University on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. That's
Okay.
also a part of the USM. And while I was there, my now wife was we met in undergrad actually, but she works in healthcare and she's really the star of the show as far as our relationship is concerned. She carries most of the weight as far as being a better human being and a smarter person and definitely makes considerably more money than I do. And she was working at George Washington University in Washington D.C. and she is from Atlanta, Georgia, and we knew that we probably wanted to start a family, and she was like, she was like, "I wanna move back to Atlanta." And I was like, "Okay, well, here's the thing, you know about my position." I had just gotten, like, the biggest NIH grant that Salisbury University had ever received.
Oh,
I was
wow.
doing really well towards tenure, but I had to make this decision where it's like, I can't just call all the universities in Atlanta and say, "Hey, my wife wants me to move back there. Will you please hire me?" It's like, are you hiring an inorganic chemist specifically in this region? And there's only 5 or 6 schools around here that would be close enough to really appease or fulfill her as far as the geographic region. So I just applied to all of them. And one of them was a tenure track position at a school here in Atlanta, and one of them was a non-tenure track position. Now, my interest initially when pursuing academia was to be at a primarily undergraduate institution because while I enjoyed research, my primary focus has always been teaching and education and pedagogy and things like that. Um, and ultimately, even though I was offered the tenure track position at the large state school here in Atlanta, Georgia, I ultimately chose the non-tenure track position. But even that, I was very fortunate that they were hiring my specific brand of chemistry at both of those places because it's not just the thing, and I think most people outside of academia don't realize this. You don't you really restricted yourself, as you mentioned, by giving yourself some sort of geographic restriction because many people, and even those that I've spoken to in this podcast episode, one person mentioned that they applied to 70 schools across the nation, and it because they were not restricted, and that kind of gives them an advantage because they're not limiting their search pool. Um, so it's fascinating to hear that similarly for you, this was a concern, and congratulations on achieving this, and hopefully it has been and achieved all the boxes that you wanted to check off in that pursuit.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really, I mean, well done getting a job in an actual city. Like,
Yeah.
when I say geographically limited, I mean, like, 4 to 5-hour drive was
Wow.
the sort of radius that I was looking.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, targeting a specific city, that's really, really, really tough. 'Cause yeah, they have to have a job
Yeah,
available.
definitely.
That sucks.
So for anyone listening that may be interested in pursuing a career similar to one that you have begun carving out for yourself, what advice would you give to someone kind of at the beginning of this journey?
I think knowing what you're in it for, maybe. I I know what I'm in it for. I'm in it because this is a career where I can think, and I feel like I am largely paid to think, and I'm paid to be creative, and I am paid to share knowledge and to bring students in and mentor and show them how they can start to independently think and ask questions and become scientists. And that is really valuable to me, and it means a lot to me. Um, and I think if you're in the beginning, there's so many other things that happen that are valid critiques of academia, that are valid concerns and challenges, but keeping your eye on what's keeping you in it. It's not going to be the money, right? And it's really not for most of us going to be the prestige or the accolades you're going to get because at most university, unless you're at Harvard, right? Like
Right.
you're not everyone's not saying your name. But it's about whatever those little things are that really get you through the day. And I think focusing on that and keeping your eye on what you're getting out of it and what is valuable to you will help to get you through the tough times, I think.
Finally, we have Dr. Rachel Bleich, who is an assistant professor of biology at Appalachian State University. Dr. Bleich, what made you decide to pursue a career in academia?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it really goes back to my days at undergrad. I was a chemistry major and got the chance to get involved with research pretty early on. I had a wonderful mentor who brought me into the lab, kind of taught me how to do all the procedures and kind of develop my own independent project. And I loved getting to the point where I could just go into the lab, do my thing, be independent. And so that was like a really critical thing, getting to present my research at conferences as an undergrad. And then also as an undergrad, as a chem major, any friend I had who had to take chemistry as part of their major or as a gen ed course often came to me for extra help. And so I found I really enjoyed kind of mentoring and tutoring other college students, even while I was a college student. So it
Oh,
made
that's
me want
cool.
to, yeah, it made me want to kind of keep doing it. So,
Yeah. So at your undergraduate institution, can you tell us what undergraduate institution that was? And also, can you talk to me about what sort of research experiences were available to you at that early stage?
yeah, great question. I went to a fairly small school called Western Carolina University, primarily undergrad, kind of out in the mountains of North Carolina. But I loved it. So our chem department did have a master's program, but a lot of the research was done with undergrads. So it was highly encouraged for students to get involved with research and just happened to have a organic chemistry lab instructor my first year who was like, "Hey, you should think about doing research with me." And so I did because at that point I didn't fully understand what that all entailed. Um,
Sure. That's
but
fascinating that you were doing undergraduate research in organic chemistry because I
yeah.
know that now you're definitely not doing organic
No.
chemistry and but definitely not doing chemical synthesis. So talk to me
No.
about so undergrad, you're doing undergraduate research in organic chemistry, and then you go and do your PhD at University of North Carolina, UNC,
Mhm.
and talk to me about that transition from organic chemistry to what you eventually studied in graduate school.
Yeah. So I'm a microbiologist now, and microbes have kind of been a common thread throughout my whole journey. So even as an undergrad doing research, we were doing some organic chemistry techniques, but we were a natural products lab. So we
Uh,
were extracting compounds from plants and bacteria, and then, doing all the characterization on those compounds.
and were these antimicrobial?
Yes, antimicrobial, anti-cancer. Yeah.
Got it.
Yep. And then for my PhD, I went to Pharmaceutical Sciences, Department of Chemical Biology and Medicinal Chemistry. And so there, I transitioned into a lab that was like half organic chemistry, half biochemistry. So I was more on the biochemistry side, kind of using microbes to make and evolved different molecules and using genetic tools to manipulate bacteria into making different molecules. So kind of using the bacteria as little factories to make
Sure.
to make drugs. Yeah.
That's really cool. So now you're a faculty member at Appalachian State University, which to
Yes.
anyone who is unfamiliar, is a very prestigious and I would argue very good R2 type of institution. And R2 is designated by the Carnegie Institution as for what type of research activity and what type of degrees an institution generally confers. So maybe a few PhDs, but mostly masters and bachelor's degrees, but definitely a high research output, especially as compared to a primarily undergraduate institution where there's a heavy emphasis on research. So now at App State, you're actually in the biology department.
I
Is
am.
that right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
talk to me. So I think a lot of people would be interested because I get this question all the time from my students. That's I want to go do a PhD in chemical engineering, but my bachelor's degree is in chemistry. Is that going to be looked unfavorable upon me in that application process because my degree isn't a one for one copy? Can you talk to me a little bit about that transition and any sort of challenges you faced in that regard?
Yeah. So after my PhD, I moved into a microbiology department for my postdoc. So that was where I got um, even more of the biology training. So much more hands on with just the microbial part of it and less chemistry part of it. I think that helped a lot. Then with developing the projects and things that would help me transition into a faculty position in a biology department. Because kind of I realized along the way that I really loved microbes and they could just do really cool chemistry. Um, yeah, I think at least in my experience moving from like PhD postdoc to faculty. It wasn't so much exactly what my degree was in, as long as I had the experience and it was, related and relevant to what I was going to be doing there and the research I was proposing to do.
That's
So,
awesome. Yeah,
yeah.
I think a lot of students that I've had in the past would be super interested to hear that it is possible to do that. Do you think that? So I remember when I was so I'm an inorganic chemist is my like official expertise. And that means when I am applying for positions, generally I'm looking for faculty positions that are open and available to inorganic chemists, right? Like I wouldn't
Mm,
apply to be a physical chemist. And so, can you talk to me about when thinking about the application process when you were pursuing your faculty position? Did this actually serve as a benefit to you, you think, because you could apply so broadly across so many different types of departments, or do you think that it was more limiting?
Oh, no, I think it was definitely made me more broadly applicable because I was mainly focused on looking at microbiologist positions because I knew that was more the research direction I wanted to go, but I definitely could have looked at biochemistry and other things more in that vein. So I think it did give me more options, for sure.
Typically, I think the narrative at large research institutions is that if you're interested in a career in academia, you would want to do your bachelor's degree and your PhD at different institutions, and then you would want to do your postdoctoral degree, or not, that's not a degree, but your postdoctoral studies at a completely different institution so that you've touched kind of three different places and gotten the lay of the land at those places and taken all the different institutional things from various places. But you're unique in that you did your PhD and your postdoctoral studies at the same institution. Can you talk to
Did.
me about why you made that choice and and also potentially do you think that it had an impact when you were searching for academic positions?
Yeah, great question. So, I was fortunate enough to stay at UNC for those 8 years. I don't think it negatively impacted my job hunt. But I will say one thing, the reason I stayed at UNC for my postdoc is that they had a really excellent postdoctoral training program that was NIH funded.
Oh, cool.
It was called Spire. It doesn't the grant funding for that ran out this summer. But it was an excellent program where they were training postdocs to be teacher scholars. So um they paid for my stipend so I could do my research, but then also have the freedom for a couple semesters to go teach a class at a
Oh, wow.
smaller institution. Yeah, and that was such a key part of me developing my, you know, academic prowess and deciding to, pursue a job at some place like Appalachian State. So,
Yeah,
um,
so to re-emphasize the difference between a R1, R2, and PUI type of institution, R2, there's definitely more of a focus on teaching. I would imagine that,
yeah.
oftentimes at large R1 institutions, think Harvard or whatever, for example, typically faculty might only teach maybe one class a year, oftentimes, especially if they're a tenured faculty member. But what's your teaching expectation at App State?
Yeah, great question. So we teach what you might call like a 3 or 9 contact hours a semester is the
Sure.
typical load. So for us in biology, that usually is like one lecture and then a couple of its associated labs.
Oh, cool.
So I could teach, like microbiology lecture and 2 micro labs in a semester, or like an intrabio lecture and a couple micro labs. It kind of just depends. So I kind of
That's cool.
rotate through a couple courses. Yeah.
So then that experience that you got through the Spire postdoc fellowship program was super beneficial because it gave you the opportunity to get that experience in teaching.
It really did. And while I was there, so I would spend like 2 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, I'd teach my class at my partner institution. And I would even they were very kind to let me have a bench in one of their shared lab
Oh,
spaces. And I
wow.
took on like 2 research students and did some like a semester long research project with them. So I think it really showed that I could navigate the balance between like doing research with students and teaching kind of at the same place.
Yeah,
Um,
that's awesome
yeah.
that they gave you that experience because I remember, like, for my own applications, a very common part of the application process is that institutions want to know about your mentoring experience, and it's something that we don't often I think most students that are unfamiliar with the process don't really consider, but it's super important because ultimately now you have your own research lab and you're training students and hopefully, showcasing, the amazing science that y'all are doing. But that's very different than teaching a class or just being a good researcher, right? Like it's a totally different skill set required to be a good mentor. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Mentoring is so crucial, especially being somewhere like App State where I'm doing my research primarily with master's students and undergrads. They're the driving force of what I do. So, yeah, being able to mentor all the different personalities that come into the lab and kind of finding ways to navigate that is can be a challenge sometimes, but is also really fun to get to know students in that mentoring role. So um, right, because you have all sorts of different personalities, different, needs. Some people need more encouragement. Some people might need a little bit of a push sometimes. So just kind of navigating that one-on-one with everybody is a fun challenge. And
Sure.
yeah, it's so important being able to pass on, the skill sets and help, each student kind of feel like they can become, independent and a scientist and a biologist and
Yeah.
go on to whatever career they're going to do next. So,
That's cool.
yeah.
Did Can you talk to me a little bit about your family history as it relates to academia? So, a common thread in these interviews that I'm doing seems to be that, some people have family members that are in higher ed, some are not, some are first generation college students, and some family really values education from an early age. But what's your story as it relates to that?
Yes, I think my family falls into the side of valuing education. So my parents are both engineers, both have bachelor's degree, and then my dad went on to get a master's in mechanical engineering and a master's in business administration. So I was the first PhD, but definitely come from pretty some high education.
Sure.
So I wanted to be a little different, even though I think engineering's wonderful, but, so I switched slightly over to science.
So, what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone who's maybe at the beginning of this journey as to if they're interested ultimately in becoming a faculty member at, let's say, an R2 institution like App State? What are
Mm.
some pieces of advice that you would give to someone pursuing this career?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I have a few, but
No, hit us with as much knowledge as you can, please.
great. So I'd say, in the role, kind of, um, my number one thing is making sure you have good mentors. So finding people all along your journey, but even as a new faculty member who can, help you out and help you when to say yes, when to say no. So definitely finding good mentors I think, is very crucial.
Sure.
And then along with that, right, one of the biggest pieces of advice I kept getting as a new faculty member is don't be afraid to say no.
Mm,
So, but I also say don't be afraid to say yes. So, make sure you can say no when it's something is not going to, maybe benefit your productivity and be good for, your career. Sometimes you have to because there's a certain amount of service and things you have to do, but not putting too much on your plate so that you can focus on being an effective researcher and teacher.
yeah.
But then also being willing to say yes to like new collaborations and new opportunities that pop up. I've had a lot of successful research productivity from collaborations that have kind of popped up since I started my position at App, and those have been really great and rewarding. And so I think there's a couple sides to that coin too. Um, and another thing, plan early and often what projects you are going to take with you. Communicate
Mm,
with your mentors as a grad student, as a postdoc, about like what's mine, what can I maybe take with me and do at my next place versus like
sure.
what's yours, what do you want to make sure it stays in your lab.
So that's actually interesting that you would mention that because I think in my experience, it was expected that you could never take anything with you. In
Oh,
fact, you could never even work on something similar to what you had done previously. So
mm,
before I let you go, can you talk to me a little bit about this process and maybe if it's
uh,
unique to your field specifically?
yeah, maybe it is a little unique in biology, but I think I was encouraged, especially since I knew I wasn't aiming for an R1 institution, um, that, I could kind of build off of the projects I did as a postdoc and into my faculty job. So I took, strains from my postdoc lab and different things,
You're talking
tissues.
about like cell strains
Or
or tissue
bacterial
strains?
strains,
Bacterial
yeah,
strains, sure.
yep, and, like, tissues from mouse models I had run as a
Wow.
postdoc that I'd had conversations with my PI, my mentor, and she was like, "Yeah, I'm not really interested in that part, so if you wanna take it as a project to work
Oh,
on
nice.
in your next job, go for it." And I
That's a
even,
huge perk.
it is, and I even piloted some experiments as a postdoc, just some, like, simple real simple things that I was just curious about. It was like, oh, that's an interesting observation. So that became a new project for my lab to do at App State. So
Nice. That's awesome.
yeah,
Yeah, I could see
yeah,
that that would be incredibly beneficial, especially as
yes,
it allows you to really hit the ground running if you know that this idea that you had already works.
yes, definitely.
That's really cool. Well, Dr.
Eh,
Bleich, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.
of course. Thank you so much for the invitation. Always happy
Yeah.
to chat.